That's obtrusive. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to NEW302. It is the 29th of October. Although I have to admit that my mind keeps telling me that it's the 31st. It feels inexplicably, maybe not that inexplicably, but it feels very Halloween-like to me today, possibly because this is the class closest to Halloween. I will confess, you may see that reflected in the second video of this week. Lemonade, it's not an autumn drink at all. I should be drinking something that has pumpkin spice, a flavor which I did manage to replicate off the top of my head with surprising success in the kitchen recently. Anyway, okay, so today's topic, the hero's journey. This is one, for this week we're talking about the hero's journey, and we're talking about stages of life, and we're talking about, there's a bunch of different things together. And also, of course, as I mentioned in the second half, I have some pieces that I want to address, but I thought it would be useful to talk a little bit about the hero's journey. I'm hoping you've read the Campbell piece, or that you are, at least in passing, familiar with the hero's journey as a concept. I'll overview it a little bit, but obviously there's no beating actually reading the material in question. I said all this as I realized that I forgot that. Okay. See, keep me honest. Okay. So, yeah, there's no substitute for actually having read the piece, obviously speaking, but there's something to be said for a bit of conceptual elaboration. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to talk about some of its modern impacts. I want to talk about some places that I have some concerns, actually, about the heroic journey and as a notion. And I would like to talk about some early instances of it. So, there's quite a bit of ground here when we're talking. So let's get into it. What's the hero's journey? Joseph Campbell. Okay, so Joseph Campbell picked up a lot of traction in the 50s. In some ways, as a public intellectual, he maybe had actually even more traction than Jung. For one thing, because he became a figure that had such central importance to, in a way, pop culture, as we'll see. So he ended up getting a lot of attention. In a way, Joseph Campbell is like distilled depth psychology, kind of, right? It's like distilled Jungian theory. He takes the same kind of core premises as Jung in a lot of ways, right? But his functional concern, in a certain sense, has to do with mythology and storytelling and folktale, mythology specifically. And, in a variety of books, right? Masks of God, Hero with a Thousand Faces, there's a bunch of them. He began to sort of build this argument where he was using the structuralist examination techniques of myth that were prevalent in the sort of 50s and 60s. That Jung is adding to that tradition and drawing from it too, but that kind of structuralist approach to things, which you see across disciplines, right? You see it in literature with Northrop Frye, who I already recommended. If you've not read Northrop Frye, read Northrop Frye. If you like literature, read Anatomy of Criticism. That book is a humdinger, as they say. I read it, or as they said, in 1930. I read it when I first read it when I was maybe 20. I wasn't a teenager, so yeah, maybe 20. I think I first got that book, and it blew my mind. But it's obviously quite connected to Campbell and to Jung and to a bunch of these things. So if you like archetype and myth and literature and drama, yeah, go read Northrop Frye. Okay, but we're not talking about Northrop Frye. We're talking about Joseph Campbell. So he comes out of this structuralist tradition, and the structuralist tradition, in a large part, is looking for common structures behind things as a method of explanation. And so Joseph Campbell's basic shtick was that he, looked at a vast number of myths across a lot of cultures and concluded that there were these underlying features that he saw being repeated again and again. And eventually he compiled these things, right, and arranged them into this kind of circular system, which he called the hero's journey, and basically said that this thing, which he called the monomyth, right, the monomyth, was in some sense the underlying structure behind an enormous number of myths. Now, people will quibble about this. They'll say there's one monomyth or there's multiple monomyths. It's not clear to me if there are multiple monomyths, why we call it a monomyth. But, right, people argue a little bit about this. But in its sort of strongest version, people will tend to say that the monomyth, right, that this hero's journey monomyth is in some sense the story, the quintessential mythological story. And as you'll see, I think that there are some ways of considering it in which that's a very plausible kind of take, right? And a lot of this is going to have to do with level of construal in our interpretation, which we'll touch on. So what are the features of this? I'm not going to go through it exhaustively because I know that you guys, I know that you have read the essay. Maybe what I'll do is punch up though real quick here, and you get to see me look stuff up in real time. Fun, right? So, you know, there are a variety of features of it, however, that are quite consistent. And if you're looking at it, if you're looking at it, if you're looking at it in terms of, you know, its basic features, you can look at it in terms of a kind of journey to the underworld and the return, right, from that underworld. Okay, so why is that sort of interesting and noteworthy? Well, not least because, okay, here I'm just going to put it up so you can take a look. Not least because for those who are tracking it, this sort of structure, you'll see in some ways shares a remarkable similarity with Jung's own autobiographical narrative about his confrontation with the unconscious, okay? So, okay, what's the classic version of this? The classic version is, you know, we have a hero, right? We'll, in the way in which it gets expressed mythologically or in sort of the fairy tale, we have this hero. He's a reluctant hero, but all of a sudden he gets the call to adventure. It's like, oh, you know, you have to go do this great thing. You have to rescue the princess or kill the dragon or both, or you need to go get the magic elixir. You need to do the thing. You are being called upon to heroism, right? There's this call to adventure. And very often, although it's not depicted in this particular chart, there is an initial refusal of that call, right? That bigger, wider, more heroic world is calling to the hero, and the hero is sort of saying no, like, no, no, no. I'm staying in mundane, everyday, prosaic world, right? I'm staying in prosaic world. I am not venturing into mythic world. Okay, so there's like a refusal. And then typically speaking, there's something that sort of reinforces or pushes on that call and pushes them forward. And you can see that there's, you know, as we go clockwise around this diagram, there is this early drop as we move from sort of the 12 of the clock down. We start to drop from the known to the unknown. This is sort of analogous to a descent to the underworld, as we'll see. So various things will happen along the way, right? Supernatural aid is a very common form of this. So like the character will meet figures who will give them supernatural assistance in some way, right? You know, so you can imagine they come to a river and the river is, uncrossable, unbridgeable, whatever. And then, you know, all of a sudden the talking trees make a, bridge out of their limbs. I'm conjuring that out of nowhere. That isn't something that I've read, but the point is that would be a very plausible sort of form of supernatural aid. Likewise, getting supernatural gifts of some kind, right, is very often a sort of early stage of this, where a figure will give people gifts, often ill-defined gifts. So like, here are 3 things and you will know what to do with them, is a pretty classic form that you see turn up all over the place, right? What is this? Well, you'll know what to do. Or open the box at the moment. Or, right, this sort of, there is an intrinsic mysteriousness to it in terms of sort of its affordance and its deployment, but nevertheless, there is this, like, this will be important, right? And you can see that in lots of stories. I imagine many of you are thinking of lots of core heroic stories that you've seen, not least things like The Lord of the Rings, right? Or Star Wars, in which these structures are pretty foregrounded in a lot of ways. Certainly it turns up in lots of other genre fiction, as we'll discuss. So genre fiction, science fiction, fantasy, to some extent horror, although it sort of depends. But these kinds of genre, so-called genre stories, cowboy stories, actually, westerns, narratives, often obey this kind of structural stuff. And we'll see that some of that has to do with the source material, and that's where Joseph Campbell is pulling his structures from. But some of it has to do with the impact of Joseph Campbell on material, which we'll talk about in a bit. Okay, so then often there is some guardian of the threshold, and you'll see that the threshold is there, right? And that's like, okay, now things are getting real. Yeah, you've committed to the quest, but this is about to get serious, and you need to get past the thing that is guarding the underworld, right? The three-headed hound of Hades, Cerberus, that kind of thing, right? You have to somehow get past this threshold guardian and through the threshold. Okay, then often there's encounters, helpers, mentors, right? So these are other figures who are accompanying you on the way, right? Think Wizard of Oz, think Obi-Wan Kenobi, think Gandalf, okay? And now we enter a phase of challenges and temptations, okay? So what's the difference between these things? A challenge typically is something that requires an outer response to best, although it may be a question of cleverness. It often is. We tend not to be actually very interested in the sorts of stories in which problems are solved through brute force, right? We don't find them particularly interesting. If problems are simply solved through brute force, we actually often don't care. And if you think about it, it's interesting, right? Because you can watch any number of action movies, and an action movie where the action is just like, and then he fought and he fought and he fought and he fought. We're not interested. We are primarily interested when, yeah, of course, skilled fighting. Everybody likes to watch, not everybody, but I am not alone in enjoying, watching a CG movie where people punch each other through buildings. But the way that those conflicts are typically expressed, right, really finds its sort of animating core when there are either intellectual problems, right, insights that need to be had, cleverness that needs to be had, or moral and ethical transformations, right? So just to bear in mind. So challenges and temptations, and you'll notice how this works, right? A challenge is something that needs to be overcome, typically through an act of skill or an act of cleverness or an act of bravery, or right. Whereas a temptation is something that looks to draw you from the path, right? It's like, no, forget about this. Don't do the right thing. This is more appealing. This is easier, et cetera, et cetera. And similarly requires a certain degree of cleverness and moral effort, and sometimes in fact requires help from forces that are outside the core hero. So not that uncommon, right, for this to be a good return moment for helpers and mentors. They come in to remind you for a second of who you really are, and so on and so forth. Okay, at the bottom of the hero's journey we've got the abyss of death and rebirth and revelation. Okay, well, what does that mean in story terms? This is the lowest of the low. It's the bottom of the underworld. It's the moment of darkness. It's the ultimate crisis. It's the right? All of those things. It's the crux of the plot, usually. And again, dramatically, we're interested in stories of character and transformation. And those can go, several ways. As a very brief aside, it's important, if we're going to talk about these sorts of stories, to distinguish between iconic and dramatic characters. It's just a useful distinction. An iconic character doesn't change, and that's the pleasure of them. A dramatic character does, and that's the pleasure of them. Okay, so to give you an idea, dramatic characters start out doing one thing, and usually the story is about how that one thing doesn't work, and can they figure out how to do a different thing, right? And that's essentially the heart of a dramatic story. Can they? And if they can, right, then often that leads to success, but it might not. Right? In which case you've got like a real tragedy, like they made the change, but they still failed. Or, they failed to do so. That's a different kind of tragedy, right? But the stories we like, the classic comedy, is the one where, of course, they do make the change and they succeed. So everybody feels good. They do the thing that we want them to do. They succeed in making the change, overcoming the blockage, whatever. Okay, dramatic character. An iconic character, on the other hand, may appear to go through such things, maybe, but their fundamental character doesn't change anyway, right? So you got Batman and James Bond are good examples of such characters. They're just, or Sherlock Holmes, typically. Now, you'll notice that more recent film versions of these characters often try to take them through dramatic arcs because somebody at film writing school told them they ought to. And usually, sometimes that's interesting, but usually it's a mistake, right? Unless it's an origin story. right? Unless we're being told the story of how that person became that person. But like James Bond, you know, to whatever extent you think James Bond is an interesting character, James Bond is an interesting character precisely in their invariability, right? It is because James Bond is always James Bond. The circumstances don't change James Bond. We just want to see James Bond do what James Bond does in James Bond-like fashion. James Bond. So that's an iconic character, okay? Just a useful distinction going forward. Okay, so the challenges and temptations section, right, brings us down to the ultimate point, which is the abyss. Why is the abyss death and rebirth? Well, the thing that dies, often, as I've mentioned dramatically, is the attitude. It's the fixation, right? So there is a self-conception. The hero, such as they are, the protagonist, has this particular fixation. This is who I am. This is what I do, right? And they have to break through that. They have to learn a different way to act, whether that's sort of to act more trustingly or to act with more courage. And typically it is an improvement, right? They must sort of break through that other moment. And in so doing, right, metaphorically speaking, they die to themselves and are reborn. See, look at like the explosion-like character of that thing at the bottom, and also like revelation, okay? Revelation, abyss, which is a very charged word, death and rebirth. And immediately afterwards, transformation, right? This is the moment of transformation. This is like what we look for in the climax. If the climax is just an inevitable sort of extension of what came before it, we're typically bored. We, in fact, want something to change, right? And that something is sort of novel. Okay, so then we get transformation. There's, you know, and that transformation can occur at different levels. In a prosaic story, right, a relatively prosaic story, so a true to life story, that will tend to come in terms of emotions or ethics, moral character, right? Those things that I mentioned. But to the extent that a story is more mythic, right, those same things may be sort of dramatized through other kinds of depictions, powers, for instance, right? So you can think of any number of science fiction and fantasy films where this moment, the moment of overcoming whatever, is then, you know, leads to powers. If you've seen, and if you haven't, you should. If you've ever seen The Matrix, right, Keanu Reeves' The Matrix, there is a very clear, obvious moment in this film where, I mean, in fact, he literally goes through death and rebirth, and on the far side, he has become a sort of a godlike being, right? And that's pretty common to this stuff too. Okay, so transformation. Then we get atonement. And atonement and the gift of the goddess we'll unpack a little bit at greater length, right? But the idea is that there is a kind of atonement often occurs in conjunction with a kind of union with the with father energies, right, at some level. But what is atonement? Well, atonement is a twofold thing, because to atone means to atone, right? It means to if you've committed a sin or a crime or something and you want to make good on it, right? You atone for your acts, right? You want to atone for things. You know, when you admit to wrongdoing or go forth to apologize or whatever, you're atoning. But simultaneously, of course, atonement is at one-ment, right? And that at one-ment speaks to something really deep and fundamental, right? That atonement is at one-ment. That when we enter this state of contrition and confession and whatever, we sort of give up this willful thing that is separating us from others and often from our sort of higher selves in some sense, right? You know, it's a thing that breaks through. If you're familiar with the character of Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost, right? You know, better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven, he says. So he loses the war against God. He gets cast down in hell, and it's better to rule in hell than serve in heaven. This is the ultimate expression of pride. It is the kind of like ultimate expression of sort of the ego. And as you'll see, we'll be talking a little bit about the ego self-axis as it relates to Edinger in this, right? And the act of atonement is an act of at one-ment because it breaks that down. It recognizes the fallibility of the ego in some sense, right? And that is part of the act of transformation, is this realization in the transformation, in the rebirth, of the hurt and wrong that one has caused, right? That sort of then brings one back into the fold. If you've ever, and I hope you have, right? This is the difficult thing for people to do, but if you've ever, after a long time, apologized for something, like something that you did where, maybe you had a friend and you were on the outs and then you didn't talk to them for like a year or something, right? Or longer. And finally you connected with them and you apologized and you meant it, right? Or even if you just like, whatever, you're frosty with somebody for a week. And then finally you're like, I think I'm being an asshole. Or at least I have some part in this dynamic. And you apologize, you atone, you try to make good. The feeling of relief that comes with the acceptance of that, I think, is actually massively surprising to people, because people hate apologizing, right? You can see it all the time. People have a refusal to apologize, right? No regrets, never apologize. And that whole ethos operates on this assumption that in some way it feels better to not apologize in many cases. Well, no, that's not true. In many cases, actually, it's tremendously relieving to apologize. So, and it brings you closer. It brings you into a state of closeness, right? And that can also be an inner state, as we'll discuss. So, atonement at one mint. The atonement very often, as I said, is also related to the father energies. And we see this simultaneously also reflected here in gift from the goddess on this chart, which is this kind of encounter with the maternal energies, okay? And you can see that here on the left half of the clock, right, as we go clockwise, that there is this gradual ascent happening back to the starting point, right? There is a circularity to it. And as we crest above this line, right, the gift of the goddess is happening at the threshold and we're returning. Well, okay, so where are you returning and what are you bringing back? That ends up being in many ways the fundamental question. And it's sort of omitted from this truncated version. As you'll see, the actual hero's journey has 22 thematic points that are structurally derived from the original, and they're not always present, but you learn to recognize it pretty easily once you start playing the game. It doesn't have to check every box. However, one of the common features that you do see that's omitted from this particular circular version is the elixir that you bring back, right? The thing that you bring back to the village. Because often, right, figuratively speaking, the reason that you're leaving the village is that the universe is out of whack in some way. Something has gone horribly wrong, right? And what the thing that you need to bring back with you is the cure. It is the magic object. It is the talisman. It is the answer. It is the insight. You come back changed and transformed, for sure. But also you bring something with you, right? And the thing that you bring with you is really what it's about. And frankly, a lot of the time in these stories, it's not the thing that you thought you were going to bring back. Very importantly, because you were transformed halfway through, right? So, okay, so you can see this general shape, and you don't have to think too hard, I think, to find examples of this plastered all over the place, particularly in the output of Hollywood, which we'll talk about. Now, in some ways, okay, this hero's journey has been used as a kind of, fundamental structure for psychological growth. It gets talked about in this way. And I'm going to actually click this off so that I can, okay. It's been used as a sort of fundamental, discussed as a kind of fundamental structure in psychological growth. And some of you will have seen that I've spoken elsewhere about this, that I have some criticisms around that. I have some misgivings around it. I do think that it is a very fundamental structure. However, to some extent, I also think that that depends on the level of construal that you're coming at this thing with. Okay, what do I mean by that? I mean that on one level, okay, if you go up to a sufficiently high level of abstraction, okay, if you go up to a sufficiently high level of abstraction, then yes, the hero's journey represents in some sense the basic pattern of a successful encounter with your unconscious, right? Now, remember, you don't have to check all 22 boxes for it to fit, but what's the basic pattern? Well, the basic pattern is this. There is a problem. You're probably resistant to that issue. You go inside of yourself. So you venture into the unknown. Now, the unknown here might be the unknown out there, and it might be the unknown within yourself. And ultimately speaking, those are expressions of the same thing. You go into the unknown, okay? You go into the underworld, and it's threatening. Otherwise, it would be people would do it all the time, right? Or you already would have solved the problem. So there is a problem. Odds are a problem with you, a problem inside you, a problem inside your inner community, okay? But it could also be a problem in your family community. Again, those aren't as distinct as you might think. So there's a problem. And part of you gives you the call. It's like you need to go inside. You need to go and figure this out, right? So you resist, but then finally you give in. You descend. You begin to have issues, right? What is it to say challenges and temptations? There are things that seem scary, monstrous, impassable, right? Or it is easy to become lost, or you don't see the way through, or it just seems, insurmountable in some way, or it's incredibly threatening. It threatens you with destruction, or it threatens your world with destruction, or any number of things. Or on the temptation side, it's like, well, it would be a lot easier to do this. Nobody will ever know. What if I just, whatever, I could employ deception, right? Various kinds of temptations. It's not bad if nobody gets hurt. Well, I have lots of other problems on my plate. This one can wait. I'll deal with it later. Any number of the things that we say, which are not entirely unreasonable, a fair bit of the time, okay, because we have limited energies, we have to prioritize things, but nevertheless, right, the abstract level, okay, challenges and temptations. And then finally, one reaches rock bottom, and there is a transformation of some kind, right? We bring something back. We have an insight, right? We have an insight. We have a recognition. And an insight doesn't have to be a completely novel piece of information. That's a mistake. People think that like an insight is like something maybe that somebody's never heard of, and that's not true. Very often, the insights that we have are the things that animate and give credence and authority to things that we said, but never deeply believed in an experiential way. We never really believed, gave our heart to them, right? Likewise, it can be the case that, like, look, the greatest wisdom of humanity is all around you. You can go look at the books, right? And leaving aside, right, the Taoist, right, Lao Tzu's contention that books were the lees and scum of dead men, which he said when he was leaving the Middle Kingdom, and the border guard, right, he's the great sage, and the border guard pleads with him, write a book. What are we going to do when you leave, great master? And he's like, lees are the books are the lees and scum of dead men. Like they're just whatever. There's no relationship to the living wisdom that's right. And the guy begs him, and he writes the Tao Te Ching, which pretty significant book of wisdom on the human scale. So the point is, there's obviously something in books. They're all around you. It's all there, right? You can go to the library. You can go to the internet. You have more access to the wisdom traditions of the world than anybody before you. But you can look at that stuff, and it doesn't necessarily connect with you. There's a big difference between hearing, there's a big difference between reading a Blake poem about infinity in a grain of sand and eternity in an hour and experiencing that state. There's a big difference between reading about falling in love and experiencing falling in love, right? Or watching a TV show about heartbreak or experiencing heartbreak, right? So insight is not necessarily in the form of totally novel things you've never heard of. It can be in the form of a transformation of experience. Now, it can also be in the form of actual, just like, boom, revelation, right? There's a reason that, as I pointed out before, Revelations is the name of the last chapter of the Bible, Revelations. And what does it mean in that context? It means the apocalypse, right? But we think the apocalypse, we think, everything's on fire. And what it means typically is like, no, the heavens break open, everything is revealed. That's what it means. It means material reality horseshit gets shredded away so that you can see the truth. That's what it means. That's what Revelations is, right? It's like a cosmically amped up version of William S. Burroughs's famous term, the naked lunch, right? From his novel of the same name, eponymous novel, which the naked lunch is the moment when everybody looks down and realizes exactly what is the end of their fork. That is revelation. So notice that it can have that character too. When you hit like rising out of the ashes and you hack away. And probably you've had things of this kind, right? Remember you realized that the world was different than what you thought, right? Or that people were different than what you thought, or that your potentials were different than what you thought. And sometimes, a lot of the time, when these things come together and they come together well, it's because you have a sudden opening of the way. You know, these sudden moments where you realize with this very clear, stark thing, just how much freedom you have. And weirdly, it's less than you think, but also more, right? Okay, so that's Revelations, bottom of the curve, right? Not to get too heavy about this. Okay, so then you're coming up the other side, right? And, you know, what does it mean to come up the other side? Well, at some point in there, you have Atonement, not surprising, given the death rebirth thing. And then you have some encounters with the father and encounters with the mother, likewise, as we pointed out in this course, pretty unsurprising, given the way your mind is built. In some sense, made of. You're made of models, and the big one, father model isn't far behind. Typically, ends are, you know, unique to you. They don't have to. It's not biologically contingent. Ultimately, at some level, right? So you can see, and what's the elixir is the thing that either solves the problem, right, resolves the issue, one, or sometimes the thing that dissolves the issue. And what do I mean by that? There's a Zen Buddhist, a Japanese word that I was introduced to by the author Douglas Hofstadter, who first wrote about it. I read it when I was a teenager. That's weird. I'm not expecting anybody in my waiting room. Okay, so read about it when I was a teenager in his book, Gödelescher Bach, which I highly recommend. Good book. Pretty out of date, but it was pretty mind-blowing when I read it the first time. And he introduces this concept that the Zen Buddhist Japanese word in question is I believe, mu, M-U. I mean, not originally M-U because it's kanji, but mu. And what's mu? Mu is the unasking of the question. It is what Wittgenstein would have referred to it at some level as letting the fly out of the bottle. Okay, because Wittgenstein said that a large number of our philosophical problems were not real problems. They were language problems, right, that were caused by having a fly. The fly was trapped in the bottle, and the answer wasn't to solve it. It was just to let the fly out of the bottle, right? So stop doing that thing. I would like to generalize that beyond philosophical problems and language lock, and instead say that a large number of our problems, period, especially as they concern our personal issues, are these locks. And they can be dissolved. They can be dissolved away. A moment of insight can unask them, right? So sometimes the elixir that comes back is a solution, right? Like the antidote. And sometimes it's like the unasking of the question. It's the recognition that there was never a poison at all, right? Okay. And even better, sometimes the recognition that what you thought was a poison is actually pretty useful. So at one level, okay, the hero's journey is generalizable to the entire process of what it means to make an encounter with the unknown in your unconscious and thereby get something useful and change it. Yes, that's true at one level. However, okay, at a more concretized level, the hero's journey, you know, obviously starts to pick up certain kinds of associated, certain kinds of associated symbolism. Right? And you see this even in the mythology. It begins to acquire a warrior ethos. And you can see it in particular in the formulation some people use. They talk about the hero's journey and they talk about it as a like, so you need to get out there and take on that world. Get out there and take on that world, right? Yeah, okay, so that's true. That's one thing. That's one thing. But the thing is this, at that level, where it's defining this kind of like warrior ethos of like honor and right, the forthright drive and action and right, that directedness and all that jazz, okay? If you take it down from that highest level of construal, a psychological encounter, and you begin to drop it down to that level at which many people talk about it, then I believe it stops being a monolith. And what I mean by that is this. At that point, the claims that people begin, that it's sort of like, this is the answer to human engagement, is like, no, it's not the only game in town. It's not the only myth. It isn't. It's not the only pattern of myth. Now, you can see some of this, in fact, implicitly in Jung's own work. So if you consider his passage, so here we start talking about stages of life a little bit, okay, just as an aside. So there's a passage in MDR, in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and it's written in other places. He has this passage where he kills Siegfried with a sniper rifle, with a gun. Boom! Right? He blows Siegfried away. And then he has, there's sort of a shadow figure with him, a blonde German culture hero, who would become or Superman. The point is that he's like an extremely positive, right? He was an associated figure, heroic figure within German myth and German national character, Siegfried, the dragon slayer. Okay, and in this game, well, that's okay. My Zoom spontaneously shut the recording off, and then it just spontaneously turned back on. So I don't know what happened there. I got too excited. I got too excited about the hero's journey and Siegfried. Okay, well, so that may come out in two chunks, and I apologize. I have no idea if it's going to stitch that together or... Okay, mysteries. Mysteries! A gremlin day. Okay, so, right, Siegfried. So, Jung has this dream. He blows Siegfried away. It starts to rain, and he experiences this tremendous relief, right? And sorry, I gotta restart this clock because I paused it when it froze up. Okay, he experiences this tremendous relief, and the relief is that nobody will know the enormity of his crime, right? Nobody will know the enormity. God is dead and we have killed him, right? The sort of sequelae of that people sort of less frequently insert is God is dead and we have killed him. And like, what must we become to justify the enormity of that crime, right? Like it places a burden of responsibility on us, is what Nietzsche is getting at. It's not just like God is dead, ha ha ha. It's God is dead and we have killed him. What must we become? What do we have to turn into? Okay, so likewise, right? He's having this moment. Now, how do we read? Well, he's killing his inner culture dragon guy. And this is precisely my think of hero's journey in those kinds of terms. I am ring hero, getting out there, getting on top of stuff, acting in the world, conquest, right? Jung points out that there's an important sense is an action that is primarily appropriate, not invariable, but primarily appropriate to the first half of your life. Right? There is a point after which that's not what you kind of need to do anymore. That it ever goes away. It's ambition. Nothing wrong with those things. But after a certain point, the looming existential questions of being begin to take on considerably great, and necessarily so. You go past 35, and the thing is that the world around you is not the world that you were born in a very important sense. Okay. Now, some of that has to do with the acceleration of change and progress on religion. We'll come back to that. But a big part of it is just like, look, you know, people die. Things go out of fashion. Things that you took for granted and found maybe mildly annoying stop being that way, right? You know, you start to experience things that once upon a time you were like, oh, this again. And instead now you experience them as precious. You start to reflect on your own limited span, your own mortality. It's a thing, right? I'm not there, I must admit, okay? But it is a thing when you begin to realize that you are closer to the end than to the beginning. And as I've mentioned before, there is a transition that happens, right? The passage of time changes us because it changes our emphasis and the reality, mostly, gradually from being predominantly about potential to being about actuality. The more things happen, the more things have happened, right? And it becomes less about all the things you could do and becomes more about the things that you have done. So, you know, and with that comes obviously reflection, right? It's less projective and less forward thinking and less whatever, and becomes more, not that there isn't a forward quality to it, but more thinking about the past, right? Now, that can easily go rancid, okay? Which is the thing that I'll talk about with many people. And, you know, it's important to distinguish between nostalgia, for instance, and rancid nostalgia. Okay, nostalgia's a thing. You can go back, you can take your yearbook off the shelf, and you can be like, oh, you know, and that can be a very positive feeling. You can drag your old albums out or remember a good time that you had with your friends, and like, that's fine, right? Look at old photos. But then there is like a gross, icky, sticky form of rancid nostalgia. It's gone rotten, and it makes you feel bad. If you're living in the past, if you're longing for good times, right? If any of you have ever seen, and if you haven't, you should, but if any of you have ever seen Napoleon Dynamite, okay, Uncle Rico is a character in Napoleon Dynamite, and Uncle Rico spends the entire film almost locked into rancid nostalgia, okay? This like, my best days are behind me kind of thing. So it can turn in that way. But the point is this, the main heroic frame, forwards, upwards, better, more, right? Conquest, that sort of worldly orientation. It's not that ambition becomes bad, but it does to a great extent become misplaced, right? It's peculiar to talk about one's existential orientation in terms of ambition. You know, you can, I guess, and that's essentially speaking, if people start to turn spiritual and they begin to be concerned with, you know, enlightenment, religion, you know, what happens when they die. And you'll note that those are concerns that people become very concerned with. So your ambitions become, you know, squaring yourself off in the world and getting yourself ready for whatever is coming, right? And maybe that nothing is coming. These are big questions. So, okay. So what I'm getting at is this. Yes, at one level, right, the hero's journey is a pattern, kind of a universal archetype for the productive confrontation with the unconscious and what you can bring back up out of it. But at another level, when it hits a certain kind of symbolic specificity, okay, a certain kind of like concretized aspect, then it turns into something else that is not the only game in town, okay? The myth of the wise old man is not the same thing as the myth of the gallant warrior, even though at some level, both of them may contain that confrontation cycle. So this is an important distinction. Now, why is it an important distinction? Okay, because if you're thinking about these things in terms of psychological development and spiritual development, okay, then this level is like bearing that in mind can be kind of useful, okay? But the way that this stuff gets deployed in the culture is typically down here. And the thing that I would like to specifically highlight here is the blockbuster. So, you know, some of you heard the spiel, bear with me. But I will tell you a story. Here is the story. It's the 1970s, the 70s, okay? And a young, fairly upstart cluster of filmmakers are making, weird, young, upstart films. The 70s was a wild time in Hollywood. Hollywood film, all kinds of interesting stuff was getting made, right? They didn't have kind of the Moneyball formula down yet, and people didn't really know what to sell, and so all kinds of interesting experimental films, right? Brilliant films coming out of the 70s. Films that I think would be difficult to make now. Anyway, so within this, a young director gets the go ahead to make this, small nostalgic 50s movie called American Graffiti. Okay. And he makes this movie and it does pretty well. It does well for itself. People like it. And because people like it, every conceivable distraction, my phone is now ringing. No, screen that call. Okay, because people like it, like it sells reasonably well, da-da-da-da-da. So the studio is positively inclined. They don't really know what sells, and they're positively inclined. And this director who has just made money with this film, American Graffiti, was like, hey, I have a project in mind. And they're like, yeah, what the hell, why not? Here you go, kid. Have $15 million, which in 70s dollars was not nothing, right? And he's got this weird script, okay? And the weird script is like a mishmash of samurai movies and World War II themes and mysticism and robots and space wizards and hairy giants and right. And it's a mess. His screenplay is a mess. It's a hot mess. Okay. It's an incoherent hot mess. If you've looked at early versions of it, it's just like a cauldron of influences with no coherent shape to any of it, really. And then this young director reads Joseph Campbell. He reads about the hero's journey. And what he does is something that has not been done before. He takes Joseph Campbell's structure, which has been compiled by looking at hundreds or thousands of years of myths, right, across the entire globe, and sort of condensed down into this basic sort of structural form. And he takes it and he looks at these like 22 points and he says, here is my roadmap. What I'm going to do is make a myth with this thing. I will take my cauldron of, pulp influences and, pastiche and strangeness and homage, and I will take that stuff with all of its fantastic strangeness, but I will put it into a myth. I will structure it using this work by Joseph Campbell. So he does. And what he creates is Star Wars, the first film, Star Wars, what we would now call A New Hope, Episode 4, but back in the day it was just Star Wars. Okay. And this film explodes in the culture. Like, I know some of you have heard me do this bit, but like, it's hard to overstate to some extent how this was a phenomenon that had not been seen. And it caught the studios by surprise. People saw this film over and over again. The licensing and marketing rights for it blew through the roof, and people were like, it was obsessive. It was a moment in a way that obviously, right, things had popularity and currency and stuff, right? But like, this was like nothing they'd seen. And then he applies the formula and he does it twice more, right? With, frankly, some slightly better writers on board. Thank you, Lawrence Kasdan. He does it with some slightly better writers on board. And by the time he's done, he's sort of run through this cycle in this way, and he's created this document that's obviously had this tremendously powerful effect. Now, some of it helps. There's some good performances in there. There are some neat special effects, especially for the time period, right? He did cool things to make it visually interesting. And frankly, his influences are interesting. As much as people say that this guy, George Lucas, who created Star Wars, is a ripoff artist, actually, look, he does some interesting creative stuff. But the point is, nobody had consciously really taken the Monomyth and applied it in this way. And the reaction that it had caught people's attention. That is to say that it created the age of the blockbuster film, the tentpole film for the summer. That wasn't a thing before that. Movies got released. Yeah, they had popularity, whatever. They were like, oh, this is a must-see film, whatever, but not like that. Since then, okay, Hollywood has analyzed it to death, right? They've tried to figure out what makes it work. And they've applied it in, a bunch of other places and areas. In fact, it's become such a mainstay in screenwriting that it's, in many cases, kind of nauseating, right? If you take kind of a crappy mid-tier fantasy or science fiction film, you're almost always going to get some kind of hero's journey thing, and it will be like smacking you in the face with it, right? It'll be very blunt, right? Insultingly so, actually, which indicates that a couple of things. One, that of course people are getting wise to the structure. It's becoming predictable, right? And predictability is not great in stories in that way. But also, also that that they're maybe hitting the button a bit much, and we'll come back to that in a second. Because Disney, for instance, understands this like implicitly and excruciatingly well, right? They totally get it. They understand how to apply it. The way that they've cranked out Marvel movies, the way that they've done this stuff, they have had some missteps, but they, essentially speaking, understand how to take mythology and use it to influence people. And that is what the screenwriting industry and Hollywood have sought to do. Now, my problem with this, as I've sort of alluded to, is this. The idea that there is only one mythic structure that we ought to be hitting on over and over and over again has a tendency to sort of overemphasize that particular kind of energy within the popular consciousness, right? To overemphasize it in the popular consciousness. And so all this emphasis on the heroic drive, right, it tends to pull our energies further and further and further away from the way that the heroic drive might be emphasized in an inner way. Because it's really hard to see spiritual transformation on the screen, right? Like, yes, at the very high level, the hero's journey is, right, abstractly speaking, about this entire, can be about this entire confrontation. But on screen, right, it tends to be concretized, right? Visually concretized, okay? Now, things are getting a little better in that respect. I'm very curious to see what happens with Dune, for instance. The Denis Villeneuve version of Dune that's coming out, because, spoilers, there's some hero's journey aspects to that. But anyway, you know, and although patterned in an interesting way, if he does a good job of the source material. So the point is, right, that we have a certain kind of overemphasis, and that overemphasis, you know, often leads us to particular kinds of formulations. Yes, the hero's journey, but like, what are we talking about when we're talking about those terms? And if it's just driving people in the direction of overt external action, right, what that's doing is reinforcing relatively facile extroverted tendency, right? That's what our culture already wants us to do. Get out there and act, right? The introvert, right, or the idea that you can process things, that there can be an inner journey and an inner struggle and stuff, tends to be pretty de-emphasized, right? Okay. The hero's journey. Wow, I am not going to get all this into this first hour. Okay, I don't know why I'm surprised at this point. Okay, now that does raise, well, I guess, a couple of other concerns that I sometimes have about the hero's journey, and it's interesting to talk about these things. So I'll share these concerns with you. And bear in mind that I don't know that these concerns were concerns of Jung's himself, but I think that they're interesting to consider when you're thinking about the archetypal in this sense. Okay, so the first one is this. Is it possible to burn out a myth? Is it possible to burn out a myth? Okay, so consider for a second that, you know, prior to the modern era, how would we have consumed these sorts of stories, right? Well, we would have consumed them as myth. And different cultures have different ways of deploying myth, but generally speaking, myth is attached to a kind of annual cyclical cycle, right? You can think about the way that religions typically tell certain kinds of stories at certain times of year, right? It's designed, you can see, again, there's a circularity to it, right? That has to do with this kind of recurrent, right, regularity in the structure of time. That's what's one of the things that's terrific about ritual, right? Ritual is archetypally because we because we are familiar with it. It lends structure, right, to time. So, okay, so that's fine. But then just like project yourself back like 1,000 years, okay? Literacy, not widespread. So you would have heard these stories probably in an oral context for most people, right? Some people would have had access to writing. It sort of depends where you were in the world. But for many people, you're dealing with an oral context. That means you're dealing with a storyteller. And the storyteller isn't just going to like tell that story anytime you feel like it. He's not Netflix, right? And he's not just going to tell that story every time you want to hear it. Again, it's not Netflix, right? He's not like there are some stories that you're going to hear with a certain amount of frequency, but you're going to hear many stories, like once a year, twice a year. And the story is going to shift slightly in the telling, but the basics of it, right? You're going to hear periodically over time. When it hits you, you will also hear it at life transition moments, right? Initiations have stories attached to them, right? There are stories attached to certain kinds of services and religious services and rituals and things. But the point is, like, stories weren't the kind of thing where you could just consume the same story with the same myth every single day, right? Now you can. So the question is this, right? Like, we can get desensitized to all kinds of things. And the question I sometimes ask is, yeah, the hero's journey is terrific because it really motivates people. That's the whole point of the blockbuster. It makes people feel amazing. That's why Star Wars had that response. Yeah, it was cool, but that wasn't it. It's about the way that it makes people feel. We're used to thinking of stories as using, the medium, the instrument of text, the novel, the whatever, or the screen or whatever. But that's wrong. The medium is just that. It's a medium. That's not the instrument. You're the instrument. It's playing you. It's playing your emotional system. That's the point. If you can hit a bunch of people with certain feelings, then you will get certain kinds of responses out of them. If you link it in symbolic ways, right, you'll know that's also the basics of propaganda. That's the basics of ritual, right? The continuity between art and this stuff is strong. But the point is, right, if you make certain kinds of stories available on tap, and you hit people with those stories over and over and over again, over and over and over and over again, can you burn them out? That's the question. Now, part of me says no. Part of me says, like, look, boy meets girl. I understand I'm being sexist here, but boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back. That's as basic a pattern as you can get in fiction. Okay, it has a shape. It's the basic Aristotelian comedy, right? So it's up, boy meets girl, down, boy loses girl, up, higher than it started, boy gets girl back, right? And that structure, it's powerful and it produces emotional results. Now, you have to take pains not to make it too predictable, right? Not every rom-com works equally well. But what's amazing is that they keep working, right? And that comedies in general keep working, right? That basic structure, I mean, Star Wars is that. It's not a rom-com exactly, but right? Things are going well. Oh God, things are going very poorly. Yay, things worked out. That's the basic of comedy. And when I say comedy, I don't mean ha 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 comedy. I mean stories with a positive feeling associated with them. Okay, Aristotelian comedy, as opposed to Aristotelian tragedy, which of course does the opposite. It's like, oh no, things are going well. Oh good, they're going okay. Oh God, worse than I thought. Okay, so remember that structure. It's very important for essay writing also, which we'll come back to. So, and you're going to say, like, oh, like writing essays about it. And I mean, like, no, literally structuring your essays effectively. So we'll come back to that. But my point is this: it's like on one level, one is inclined to say, nah, you can't burn that out, right? You just reclothe it, and you reclothe it for every age. And yes, specific formulations can exhaust people, or people can become inured to them, right? So Christianity has lost a lot of traction in the West, over the last, let's call it a couple of hundred years. It's been longer, but a couple of hundred years, there's been a steep slide where lots of people who formerly, familially would have identified as Christian, or even do identify as Christian, no longer, right? The stories of Christianity no longer connect with them. Okay. Now, if you do happen to be Christian, or even if you don't, I think that there's a lot in there. I spent a ton of time when I was 21 connecting with that stuff. And doing so proved to be tremendously powerful. Like, there's a reason it was popular for 2,000 years, But the point is, most of those story formulations, traditional formulations, that stuff, people, right? But the Matrix, which is also death and rebirth, right? And saviordom, et cetera, same story, right? But in a different key. It's clothed differently. And people responded to it enormously, right? So one part of me says, no, you can always reclothe it. But another part of me says, okay, but humans are tremendous pattern finders. We're really good at generalizing patterns. And we're capable of adjusting to almost anything, right? Humans are capable of adjusting to almost anything, any kind of circumstances, right? There's the broad notion of desensitization and what they consider to be like the monkey house effect. You walk into the monkey house at the zoo, you know, where the monkeys are, and God, the smell, right? It's just like, you know, I don't find it particularly appalling because animal smells don't bother me that much. But for many people, it's just like, right, terrible smell. 5 minutes later, you barely notice it. You've adjusted. And the same thing can be true of all kinds of things. People can adjust to tremendous atrocity, right? They can adjust to, you know, incredible conditions of pain and so on and so forth, right? Okay, so likewise, the question is, can we adjust in a negative sense? Can we get so hit with so many different variations of a basic pattern that the basic pattern itself begins to bore us, right? And so I worry about this sometimes, because I worry that like the essential profit motive that drives this, because that's what it is, right? When these companies are putting up blockbusters, they're not putting these things out to inspire you. Not really. They're not. They may piggyback on that idea, right, to get an Oscar bid. So inspiring. It's a money-making venture. Of course it is, right? It's a money-making venture. Somebody is hammering your emotional buttons for money. Now, you are consenting to this. You are asking them to hammer your emotional buttons. It's not like they're forcing it on you. You don't have to participate. You do it because you expect to get a positive experience out of it. But the point is, now a story that maybe you would have heard once or twice a year, or maybe if only a few times in your life, suddenly you are hearing over and over and over again in incredible graphic detail that outstrips anything, any degree of description and anything that you could experience in your life. It's bigger than your life in some important sense. And also it's boring. The number of people that I talk to who are just like, oh, they've just had it up to here with superhero movies. And why? Well, because we're drowning in them. And I like that stuff. But they're really like hammering the same structures over and over and over again. So that's the question. Can we burn out, right? Now, I'm not saying this is Jung's concern, but it's a concern that I sometimes have because it has to do with the way that we have weaponized our mythology, right? The way that we have commodified it, obviously, but the way that we have weaponized it. Okay. So I only have 57 seconds left on this one. I'm going to have to carry this over. And then I guess I'll just have to fit in the other bit that I want to say on that side. Okay, so I don't know if this is going to turn into one video or two, behaving very strangely, but I'll see you for part 2.